Oh, wait.
Anything almost could tip it off and cause it to step into another civil war. That's what I want to talk about today. Stay with me. Hello, everybody. I am Attorney Augustus
sorry.
one
I
half
just,
of the
you know what
Defiant
happened?
Lawyers.
I never
And each
pushed
and
the
every week, we
live
bring you
button
at least one
to go
legal
live,
analysis
but
of some
okay, now
trending
you can
story
do it,
having to do
right?
with politics,
Stupid.
policies,
When I went to change it
personalities,
to cut it
or
off,
pop
that's
culture
when I realized.
to empower you with the
All
information
right.
you need to defy an
right.
unjust legal system. If that interests you, and I certainly hope it does, please like, share, comment, subscribe, and click the bell so you'll get notification every time we upload one of these powerful, informative videos. So yes, civil war is on the table. Sadly and unfortunately, our nation has a history of civil war, and many people, many experts predict that we could have another civil war. So that's trending. In fact, there's a movie out right now, so I got to discuss it. None of us want to talk about the potential of another civil war in this country, but that's where we are, and that's what we got to face. So we're going to get into it. Stay with me like I asked you in the beginning, all the way through the end. It is important that you see the end material, because it's in the end material that I'm going to tell you, especially you African Americans, how we can play our part in preventing another civil war, but how we can prepare for it in the event that it happens nonetheless. So make sure you stay with me through the very end. Now, you know my videos tend to be longer than others because I share information with you, I teach you, I make sure you have the facts and not just my opinion. I don't want you to base anything just on my mere opinions. I want you to have the facts. And in this case, we're going to look to the experts. As an attorney, that is one of the things I do quite often when I'm in trial. I am not a jack of all trades. I have a specific skill set as an attorney and as a minister, but I don't know everything. And when I don't know something, I turn to those who do. So we're going to look at the experts. We're going to turn to the experts regarding civil war. Okay, so stay with me through the very end. Now, please grab your copy of my book, Education and Justice. If you have a young boy or young girl, for that fact, in the public school system, and they are African American, you need this book because I discuss and detail what they're doing to our children in the public school system. And then I equip you with the information you need to advocate for your child. So Head over to Amazon and get your copy. And thank you so much. And thank you all for all the support that you're showing the Defiant Lawyers YouTube channel. We appreciate it very much. All right, so let's get into this. Again, will Trump and MAGA cause another civil war? Will Trump and MAGA cause another civil war? What Black Americans can do to prevent and prepare for another potential civil war. When I told my wife what the subtitle was, she said, wait a minute, if we're working to prevent it, why do we need to be prepared for it? Because the prevention may not work. And if the prevention doesn't work, then we need to be prepared, right? So that's why I'm going to end this video by talking about what we can do as African Americans to prevent and to prepare for this potential civil war. Okay, so let's get into this. Hey everyone, I am Attorney Augustus Corbett, one half of the Defiant Lawyers. Recently, I took a look at our analytics and I noticed something shocking. Many of you watch our videos and I believe you enjoy them, but you haven't subscribed yet. What are you waiting for? Again, I was shocked because I know our content is empowering and informative. Plus, our 2024 goal is to have 150,000 subscribers before the end of the year. Please help us by hitting that subscribe button, especially you young folks. We particularly want to increase our number of young subscribers. Thanks for all your continued support. We appreciate it very much. CNN did a piece recently, and someone expressed their opinion here about whether a civil war was possible in this country, another civil war. And I want to read a little bit of that article, and we're going to do quite a bit of reading in this video. So 3 months into 2024, it seems dire predictions of political violence are now commonly issued, both by the country's extreme fringes as well as from the mainstream. Former President Donald Trump has been perhaps the most vociferous prognosticator, warning that there would be bedlam in the country should the criminal charges against him lead to a 2024 election loss. So we don't have to wonder who is out there touting and promoting violence and civil war. It is the former president, Donald Trump, unfortunately. Nowadays, even seemingly mundane political procedures can also result in promises of violence. When the U.S. Supreme Court sided with the Biden administration in January, allowing federal border agents to remove concertina wire put in place by the state of Texas, some in elective office said it was a sign of civil war. In its threat assessment for 2024, the Department of Homeland Security forecast that, among other threats, the 2024 election cycle would be a key event for possible violence. So there it is. Now, in her 2022 book, How Civil Wars Start and How to Stop Them, renowned political scientist Barbara F. Walter argues that we are closer to civil war than any of us would like to believe because of a toxic mix of political extremism and polarization, social and cultural tribalism, the popular embrace of conspiracy theories, proliferation of guns and well-armed militias, and the erosion of faith in government and the liberal Western democratic state. Among the key factors she cites is accelerationism, which Walter describes as the apocalyptic belief that modern society is irredeemable and that its end must be hastened so that a new order can be brought into being. So that's where we are. And you heard that straight from an expert on civil war. And the talk of violence by especially those extremists on the right, they just seemingly are itching for a civil war. They are itching, just seemingly itching to start shooting, to take us down a path of bloodshed and violence, unfortunately. And if you don't believe that, as I always say, just go back to January 6, 2021, and we see what the right-wing extremists are capable of doing. So whether we want to look at it or not, that is where we are. We are in the vicinity of another potential civil war, but it's not too late to stop it. And again, that's what I want to end this video on. But before we reach an end, we need to talk about some of the things that Professor Walter says in her book. So yes, Professor Barbara F. Walter, How Civil Wars Start. I want to recommend her book. It is a fascinating read. I've read it from cover to cover. Again, fascinating. All right. Now, Professor Barbara F. Walter, PhD, is one of the world's leading experts on civil wars, violent extremism, and domestic terror. She is the author of 5 books. She's also the Rohr Professor of International Affairs at the School of Global Policy and Strategy at UC San Diego. That is the University of California, San Diego. She received her MA and PhD from the University of Chicago and did postdoctoral fellowships at the Olin Institute of Strategic Studies at Harvard University and the War and Peace Institute at Columbia University. Walter is a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and the National Academy of Sciences. So we see here, Professor Walter is more than qualified. I just qualified her. So we can take what she says very seriously because this has been her space. She has been studying Civil War for years. And I want to, from the beginning, just extract something that she says, I believe in the last chapter of the book, but I want to cite it first because I believe it is the root cause of all the angst and the possibility and potentiality of us going to or experiencing another civil war. She says, the greater the minority population, the greater the threat to white supremacy, the greater the white backlash. That is the root of what could amount to a civil war. As our country goes to being a majority minority country, white Americans are really unsettled by that possibility. The fear of that in the hearts of many white Americans causes them to react and to react strongly. Now, I believe it was the election and re-election of Barack Obama that really set that fear off in the hearts of many white people. That said to them that they were losing the country. And then they began to start doing things to try to prevent the loss of the country. They don't want to be a country where the minorities are the majority because they have enjoyed white dominance, white supremacy for centuries here in America. And the very thought that minorities would be in the majority to them again is very unsettling. And so what we're dealing with now, what we're seeing is the white backlash from that. And we're seeing it politically. We're seeing it, yes, in the political realm. We're seeing it in the economic realm, right? With all the anti-DEI stuff. We're seeing it across the board. White people trying to hold on to white dominance. But I think they're fighting a losing battle because the country's changing, period. So Professor Walter says, in 2010, an article published in the American Journal of Political Science caught my attention. Written by a team of academics, it featured the work of researchers who belong to something called the Political Instability Task Force, PITF, a group of academics and data analysts who were asked to convene at the behest of the U.S. government in 1994. The experts at the PITF had taken Civil War data from around the world and built a model that could predict where instability was most likely to occur. So basically, a group of academics started collecting data on Civil War back that's 30 years ago. And based on that data, they now are able to sort of predict what country is vulnerable to civil war. They're able to look at that data and say, okay, this particular country or these countries are vulnerable to civil war. All right, now, the idea that researchers could predict civil conflict was revolutionary. And so in 2017, when I was asked to join the PITF myself, I did not hesitate. For almost 5 years, I attended meetings and conferences with other scholars and analysts in which we studied political volatility around the world, the potential collapse of Syria, the future of African dictators, and came up with ways to further refine the predictive possibilities of the data at our fingertips. Our goal was to try to anticipate violence and instability in other countries so that the United States was better prepared to respond. But as I did this work, watch what she says here, I realized something unnerving. The warning signs of instability that we have identified in other places are the same signs that over the past decade, I've begun to see on our own soil. This is why I witnessed the events in Lansing, as well as the assault on the U.S. Capitol in January 2021 with such trepidation. And I can see those signs emerging here at a surprisingly fast rate. The plot in 2020 by a group of white nationalists and anti-government militias in Michigan is one of those signs. Civil war in the 21st century is distinctively different from civil wars of the past. Gone are the large battlefields and the armies and the conventional tactics. So she says here that when she began to look at this data from this group that she was invited to be a part of, she said, wow, this data is pointing to the United States of America. The very data that they use to predict civil war in other countries, she realized that that data was highly predictive of a potential civil war here in America. This is an expert talking. This is not just some person who knows nothing about civil wars talking. This is an expert who has studied civil wars at the PhD level for many years. And the data that she is very familiar with, that she has and others have collected from countries that have experienced civil war, that data predicts or suggests that civil war is possible here as well. Now, she does say that civil war in the 21st century is distinctly different from civil wars of the past. She says, gone are the large battlefields, the armies, and the conventional tactics. Today, civil wars are waged primarily by different ethnic and religious groups, by guerrilla soldiers and militias, who often target civilians. The unrest in Michigan, if you look closely, features these very elements. The state is deeply divided along racial and geographic lines. Two of its major cities, Detroit and Flint, are predominantly African American, while its rural areas are 95% white. Economic decline in the state has created deep personal discontentment, especially among its rural residents, which has led to anger, resentment, and radicalization. Michigan also has a strong anti-government culture and one of the highest numbers of militias of any state, creating ready-made units for violence. It is no surprise that one of the first attempts to instigate a civil war happened here. She says that a kidnapping attempt by a group of far-right extremists is a sign of impending civil war may strike you as preposterous. But modern civil wars start with vigilantes just like these, armed militants who take violence directly to the people. Militias are now a defining feature of conflicts around the world. In Syria, anti-government rebels were a hodgepodge of insurgents and freed prisoners fighting alongside the violent extremist group ISIS. Even Syria's largest early rebel faction, the Free Syrian Army, was a mix of hundreds of small, loose-knit groups rather than a centrally led organization. Ukraine's current civil war is being fought by bandits, warlords, private military companies, foreign mercenaries, and regular insurgents. The same is true in Afghanistan and Yemen. The era of a single, regimented, and hierarchical fighting force in official military uniform using conventional weapons is over. And I think that is critical because she is talking about the type of insurgency that we saw again on January 6, 2021. Not what we learned from the history books about how the North and the South, again, faced each other on battlefields. No, that's not what we're looking at. And that's based on the data that she has studied from around the world from other civil wars. So she goes on to say, today's rebel groups rely on guerrilla warfare and organized terror, a sniper firing from a rooftop, a homemade bomb delivered in a package, detonated in a truck, or concealed on the side of a road. So she's showing and telling us, based on current civil wars or past civil wars in the recent past, how these civil wars are fought so that we can have an understanding of how it would likely be fought here should, God forbid, our country experience another civil war. Most Americans cannot imagine another civil war in their country. They assume our democracy is too resilient, too robust to devolve into conflict, or they assume that our country is too wealthy and advanced to turn on itself, or they assume that any rebellion would quickly be stamped out by our powerful government, giving the rebels no chance. They see the Whitmer kidnapping plot or even the storming of the U.S. Capitol as isolated incidents, the frustrated acts of a small group of violent extremists. But this is because they don't know how civil wars start. This is an expert warning us to take this threat of another civil war very seriously. Don't think about civil war in the terms and the ways that we learned about civil war from the 19th century, right? The civil war we experienced here over slavery. It's very different. So let's read some from chapter 1. Now, we're doing a lot of reading because, again, I want you to get it from the horse's mouth. I don't want to paraphrase what she's saying. This is too critical. It's too important. So I want you to read it for yourself and see it for yourself as she relays it in her words. All right, so she says, over the past 100 years, the world has experienced the greatest expansion of freedom and political rights in the history of mankind. In 1900, democracies barely existed, but by 1948, world leaders had embraced the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which was signed by almost all of the UN member states. It asserted that every person had the right to participate in his or her government, the right to freedom of speech, religion, and peaceful assembly, and that they had these rights no matter their sex, language, race, color, religion, birth status, or political views. Today, almost 60% of the world's countries are democratic. So she's saying over the last 100 years, the world has experienced this growth of democracies. And she's going to go on to say that that has been good for the world because people really appreciate freedom, a freedom that includes everyone, blacks, whites, Asians, Arabs, Indians, so on and so on, right? People feel better. Folks are less likely to become violent when they are participating in their government. Unlike, for example, the Declaration of Independence of our country here, that was written primarily for white male property owners. That started out wrong in the first place. So these democracies around the world, and the democracy, the Democratic Republic that we evolved into here in America over a 400-year long fight, we had to fight to produce the type of democratic republic, or democracy for short, that we have today. And that brings about stability. People, again, are less likely to rise in arms and violence when they feel like they are able to participate in the forward movement of their country. So the expansion and growth of democracies has been good. So she says citizens of liberal democracies have more political and civil rights than those who live in non-democracies. They participate more in the political life of their nations, have greater protections from discrimination and repression, and receive a greater percentage of state resources. They are also happier, wealthier, better educated, and generally have a higher life expectancy than people who live in dictatorships. It's the reason refugees risk their lives to reach Europe, fleeing more repressive countries in the Middle East, Central Asia, and Africa. And it's why President Bush, after invading Iraq, felt confident that the United States would establish a free Iraq at the heart of the Middle East and inspire a global democratic revolution. Professor Walter goes on to say, there's another big benefit of democratic governance. Full democracies, listen very carefully, are less likely to go to war against their fellow citizens and against citizens of other democracies. Let me read it again. Full democracies are less likely to go to war against their fellow citizens and against citizens in other democracies. People may disagree about what form democracy takes. They may be frustrated with democracy's need for consensus and compromise. But given a choice between democracy and dictatorship, most will gladly take democracy. That is critical. Democracies tend not to experience civil war. Stated differently, civil wars are less likely to occur in democracies. So let me stop and give you three definitions that are important when talking about civil war. So first, autocracy, a government at the will of one man called an autocrat, unchecked by constitutional restrictions or limitations. Democracy, that form of government in which the sovereign power resides in and is exercised by the whole body of free citizens. Anocracy, they are neither full autocracies nor democracies, but something in between. So look at what she says. You have on both ends of a spectrum, you got an autocracy, and at the other end, a democracy. And somewhere in the middle is an anocracy. Autocracy, democracy, and in the middle, an anocracy. All right, let's go back now with that in mind. And she's going to explain which of those three forms of government are most likely to bring about a civil war. It turns out that one of the best predictions of whether a country will experience a civil war is whether it is moving toward or away from democracy. The best predictor of instability is not income inequality or poverty. It is a nation's polity index score, with the anocracy zone being the place of greatest danger. Anocracies, particularly those with more democratic than autocratic features, what the task force called partial democracies, were twice as likely as autocracies to experience political instability or civil war, and 3 times as likely as democracies. Now, let me explain this to you. So she's saying here that countries which move toward or away from democracies are the ones that tend to experience civil war the most. And she especially points out countries that move from democracy toward anarchy are especially vulnerable to civil war. Now, let me explain why. So, if a country is a democracy, but it's moving away from democracy to an anarchy, that means the people have freedoms, but they're losing those freedoms. But because they still have some of those freedoms, they're able to arm themselves and to become violent toward each other. Whereas with an autocracy that's moving toward anarchy, the people have less freedoms to arm themselves and to bring about war, civil war, especially. So the autocracy, again, remember that is a person, an autocrat who rules over that country with an ironclad grip, and the people are not able to rise up because they are under the power of that autocrat, versus people who are in a democracy who are enjoying some freedoms, but the democracy is moving toward anarchy. Still, those freedoms that those folks had in that democracy that's now backsliding toward an anarchy has enabled those people to arm themselves, to express themselves, and therefore bring about a civil war. That describes our country. We are a democracy, a democratic republic. And let me just say, because I said in a prior video, and I want to make sure you understand the difference between a democratic republic and a democracy. Let's just say our style democracy is a democracy with checks and balances, right? It's not pure people ruled. There are all kinds of checks and balances that our Constitution put in place, right? The legislative branch checks the executive branch, and the executive branch checks the judicial branch, and even within the legislative branch, Congress is made up of the House of Representatives and the Senate, so they're checking each other. So there are a whole bunch of checks and balances, and then you got the federal government and the states checking the federal government checking the states. So we are democracy with a whole lot of checks and balances. So anyway, because we are a democracy, people have had freedoms. First Amendment freedoms, Second Amendment freedoms, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh, eighth, 10, all types of freedoms. And because of those freedoms, we have a whole lot more say, whole lot more freedoms to express ourselves, to arm ourselves, and so on. But you see it, we're moving away from our democracy. Donald Trump wants to be an autocrat, and many of his supporters want him to be an autocrat. So they are trying to move the country away from our democracy. And as they get us further and further and further away from our democracy, that brings us into a very dangerous zone, Professor Walter says, the zone of anarchy. As we backslide from democracy, that brings us to this middle area of anarchy, which the data says really is the danger zone for civil wars. And we literally see it. Literally saw Donald Trump in his first administration go after the institutions of our democratic republic. The press, the education system, the voting system, the criminal justice system, the Department of Defense, and various other institutions that Trump showed no respect toward. None. And all the while, what was happening? Moving us, inching us further and further and further away from democracy to this danger zone of anarchy, which strongly increases the possibility of a civil war. Now, this is what the experts are telling us. That's what Professor Walter is saying in her book here. Okay, let's read more. Watch this. Until recently, the way most countries ended up in the dangerous anarchy zone was when dictatorships were overthrown, as happened in Iraq, or autocrats were forced to embrace democratic reform as a result of mass protests. But after almost a half a century of increasing democratization, countries, especially newer democracies, began to move in the opposite direction. Even once safe liberal democracies such as Belgium and the United Kingdom saw their polity index scores lowered. Since 2000, democratic leaders who came to power via elections have begun to consolidate authoritarian rule. Civil war experts are once again worried. We understand that backsliding almost certainly means that the middle zone is likely to expand. The middle zone, again, being anarchy. And that is our country moving away from democracy toward this space of anarchy on its way toward autocracy. All right. So she says, democratic countries that veer into autocracy do so not because their leaders are untested and weak, like those who are scrambling to organize in the wake of a dictator, but rather because elected officials, many of whom are quite popular, like Trump, start to ignore the guardrails that protect their democracies. That describes Donald Trump to the T. A popular autocrat will protect democracies. What guardrails? Well, the rule of law, right? The rule of law. The election system, where there's always that peaceful transfer of power, and other institutions that he ignore that are put there against to protect this democracy, this democratic republic that we have built over 400 years. So she says these include constraints on a president, checks and balances among government branches, a free press that demands accountability, and fair and open political competition. Would-be autocrats such as Erdogan, Vladimir Putin, or Brazilian President Jair Bolsonaro, their political goals ahead of the needs of a healthy democracy, gaining support by exploiting citizens' fears over jobs, immigration, security. That is Trump. And these are the people that he admires. He had Orban at Mar-a-Lago just a few weeks ago. Of course, we know his affinity for Vladimir Putin. So these are the people that he admires because he wants to be in this club. Moving our country away from democracy to anarchy, which is the danger zone for civil war. And the next step is autocracy. They persuade citizens that democracy as it has existed will lead to more corruption, more lies, and greater bungling of economic and social policy. They decry political leaders' compromises as ineffective and the government as a failure. They understand that if they can persuade citizens that strong leadership and law and order are necessary, citizens will voluntarily vote them into office. People will often sacrifice freedom if they believe it will make them more secure. Then, once in power, these leaders plunge their countries into anarchy by exploiting weaknesses in the Constitution, electoral system, and judiciary. You see why I'm reading this to you? I want you to see what the experts see. Because what we just read describes the 4 years that Trump was in office, describes it to a T. And this is what the experts see with those autocratic type leaders, Orban, Putin, and others. And it's the exact thing that Trump wants to do here in many of his followers. Because what they want is a white ethno state rather than a multi-ethnic country. They want a country that remains under the ironclad control of white supremacy. And if that means making Trump an autocrat, they're all for it. But the problem is, the more Trump and MAGA takes us away from democracy, the more we get into the range of anarchy, and civil war increases dramatically. That's the problem. Because they typically use legal methods, partisan appointments, executive orders, parliamentary votes, they are able to consolidate power in ways that other politicians are unable or unwilling to stop. This increasing autocratization puts countries at a higher risk of civil war. For a decaying democracy, the risk of civil war increases almost the moment it becomes less democratic. As a democracy drops down the polity index scale, a result of fewer executive restraints, weaker rule of law, diminished voting rights, its risk for armed conflict steadily increases. This risk peaks when it hits a score of between +1 to -1, the point when citizens face the prospect of real autocracy. The chance of civil war then sharply drops if the country weathers this moment by becoming even more authoritarian, or changes course and begins to rebuild its democracy. Now, again, remember what I said. When a country is democratic, civil war typically doesn't happen. That's based on the research. It's during an anarchy that civil war, the possibility and potential of civil war skyrockets. When a country gets over into this autocratic area, civil war is almost non-existent because the people are under the strong control of the government. So it's countries exactly as ours is that are more vulnerable to civil war as they start backsliding. And she says the moment they start backsliding from democracy toward this anocratic system. All right, let's keep reading. I know we're doing a lot of reading, but I want you to understand where we are here. Now, here she talks about, and we read it earlier, accelerationism. Accelerationism. I want you to pay very close attention to what we're about to read. America's extremists today subscribe to an ideal known as accelerationism, the apocalyptic belief that modern society is irredeemable and that its end must be hastened so that a new order can be brought into being. Now, I want you to understand what you just read. Accelerationism is this apocalyptic belief that a country is so corrupted, so messed up, that the end of that country has to be hastened. In other words, it needs to be brought down fast so that a new order can begin, can emerge. And she says that is the belief of our country's extremists, these extremist groups. So that's why they take no compromise, the extremists, none, no compromise. In their minds, the only thing that can be done at this point is to bring the country down so that a new order can be established. No compromising, none of that. No democratic compromising, no political compromising, just bring it down so that something new, again, a white ethno-state, can begin. She goes on to say, in a way, it's their language for pushing the country up the insurgency scale and perhaps also toward ethnic cleansing. Wow. Adherents believe that they are not making enough progress through regular means, rallies, election of right-wing politicians, and as a result must precipitate the change through violence. As terrorism expert J.J. McNabb has explained, they are looking for any excuse, from COVID lockdowns to protests for racial justice to incite conflict. The hope is that this will set off a chain reaction of violence, which will in turn cause moderate citizens, their eyes now open to government oppression and social injustice, to join their cause. So, wow, the extremist believes in this notion of accelerationism, where this thing has to come down. The country has to come down. It has to fall. They have to violently bring it down so that a new world order can be established, one that, again, is based on white supremacy. And that is accomplished by acts of violence. And it is justified based on anything, she says, like the COVID lockdowns. You know, they interpreted that as the government is taking away your freedoms. Wearing masks is taking away your freedoms. Vaccinations, taking away your freedoms. So they will use any and everything. The protests from the George Floyd lynching. How did they interpret that? How did Trump handle that? They're taking away your freedoms. The Civil Rights Act, taking away your freedoms. The Voting Rights Act, taking away your freedoms. Any and everything that they deem that infringes on white supremacy can be used to justify violence and hopefully turn the hearts of moderate whites toward them so that, you know, their numbers will increase and they can succeed in bringing about this new white world order. She says it's noteworthy that the United States has the highest number of privately owned firearms globally, although it makes up just 4% of the global population. So now she's talking about the proliferation of guns in our country. So she says again, although it makes up just 4% of the global population, it holds around 40% of all civilian firearms, according to research from the Small Arms Survey based in Switzerland. The estimates suggest there are 393 million private firearms in the U.S., more than the combined total in the top 25 countries. Furthermore, the year 2020 set a record with nearly 23 million firearms purchased, the highest annual number documented. Why so many guns were bought in 2020? Because, as she explained, the measures to control COVID were exploited to say that the government is taking away your freedoms. So folks, white people especially, went out and started buying a bunch of guns. And in response, an increased number of black folks started buying guns, adding to this powder keg that could explode into a civil war. All right, now that's all we're going to read from her book. Now we're going to turn our attention to what to do about this, right? So I'm sure a lot of African Americans would say, well, if they start this civil war thing here that you're talking about, what about law enforcement? Won't law enforcement protect us? Well, I wouldn't be so sure. Let me explain why. White supremacist groups have infiltrated U.S. law enforcement agencies in every region of the country over the last 2 decades. According to a new report about the ties between police and far-right vigilante groups, in a timely new analysis, Michael Gurman, a former FBI special agent, has written extensively on the ways that U.S. law enforcement have failed to respond to far-right domestic terror threats. Concludes that U.S. law enforcement officials have been tied to racist militant activities in more than a dozen states since 2000, and hundreds of police officers have been caught posting racist and bigoted social media content. The report notes that over the years, police links to militias and white supremacist groups have been uncovered in states including Alabama, California, Connecticut, Florida, Illinois, Louisiana, Michigan, Nebraska, Oklahoma, Oregon, Texas, Virginia, Washington, and West Virginia. So they have identified outright white supremacist connections with law enforcement in at least those states. So white supremacist groups have essentially infiltrated U.S. law enforcement agencies in every region of the country. So should a civil war break out? I don't know if it's wise to depend exclusively on law enforcement. The report was issued by the Brennan Center for Justice. The name of the report is Hidden in Plain Sight: Racism, White Supremacy, and Far-Right Militancy in Law Enforcement. The report says, police reforms, often imposed after incidents of racist misconduct or brutality, have focused on addressing these unconscious manifestations of bias. The U.S. Department of Justice, DOJ, for example, has required implicit bias training as part of consent decrees. It imposes to root out discriminatory practices in law enforcement agencies. Such training measures are designed to help law enforcement officers recognize these unconscious bias in order to reduce their influence on police behavior. These reforms, while well-intentioned, leave unaddressed an especially harmful form of bias, which remains entrenched within law enforcement: explicit racism. So this report says the real issue is not just implicit bias, it's explicit racism, explicit, blatant racism in law enforcement. Explicit racism in law enforcement takes many forms, from membership or affiliation with violent white supremacists or far-right militant groups, to engaging in racially discriminatory behavior toward the public or law enforcement colleagues, to making racist remarks and sharing them on social media. While it is widely acknowledged that racist officers subsist within police departments around the country, federal, state, and local governments are doing far too little to proactively identify them, report their behavior to prosecutors who might unwittingly rely on their testimony in criminal cases, or protect the diverse communities they are sworn to serve. This report tells us, not based on anecdotes, but based on research, that white supremacists have infiltrated many law enforcement agencies across this country. And I can tell you myself, as a civil rights attorney, as a criminal defense attorney, I see all too often, all too common, racist law enforcement officers. I'm gonna tell you this too. There are a whole lot of black officers you also cannot trust, because they are supporting their white supremacist law enforcement brothers. So I don't know if it's smart for you to be saying if a civil war were to break out, I'm going to rely on law enforcement. It's probably not a wise decision. Now, let me go back to what Professor Walter said about the anocracy zone being the most predictive of civil war. Here is a graph that she created, included in her book. And you see democracy, then in the middle, anocracy, and then autocracy. And you see this graph, the data points go way up in the middle of an anocracy. And if you recall our definition, an anocracy is not an autocracy or democracy, it's in the middle. And countries enter the anocracy zone when they move away from democracy, such as our country, or move away from autocracy. The example she gives is Iraq. So regarding our country, we are a democratic republic. Many call us a democracy. And as we start moving away from those democratic principles and institutions, war begins to increase dramatically. And that is exactly what is happening. And it really accelerated during Trump's first administration. All right. So I wanted you to see the graph, to see this anocratic zone where civil wars tend to occur. Now, one last graph here. So we see from this particular slide what brought about increased gun sales from 2010 to now. First, the Obama years. Fear was struck in the hearts of many whites that this was now the beginning of the end for white supremacy. A Black president elected and reelected. So let's buy guns to protect white supremacy. And so gun sales increased dramatically. But the biggest jump occurred when COVID hit the scene. 2020 was a record-setting year for gun sales. All the policies and measures that the government implemented to control COVID, the far right began to tell the GOP trying to take over your life, trying to take away and strip away your freedoms. But something else happened in 2020. The lynching of George Floyd and a whole lot of protests. Blacks and whites began to hit the streets in protest. Some were saying that this was a racial reckoning. Well, Donald Trump was also fanning the flames, right, of racial hatred, and others along with him. And they were saying, you know, buy more guns, arm yourselves, because all this protest may be the beginning of a civil war. So buy guns. And as I said earlier, a whole lot of Black folks too began to buy guns. So how to prevent civil war? It should be really obvious from what Professor Walter told us in this book. Protect our democratic republic. You can call it democracy. We need to protect it. And the number one way to protect it right now is to keep Donald Trump out of office. This is not just about politics. And I am not a Democrat. I'm not a Republican. But I know a threat to our country when I see it. And this professor, based on data and research, is warning us that as the country follows Trump away from democracy into anocracy, that increases the chance of civil war. So what can we do as a collective, as citizens of the United States of America, is to keep Trump out of office, because he will come in office and will do even more to kick the checks and balances, to disregard them, to dismiss them in his effort to move the country further away from democracy toward autocracy. But before the country can become autocratic, it will become anocratic, which will skyrocket the chances of civil war. So the most important thing that we can do to prevent civil war, folks, is to keep Donald Trump out of office. Now, in the event that civil war occurs nonetheless, because there are forces out here who are saying if Trump is not elected, in fact, Trump himself says that, there will be chaos and havoc, violence, and they will try to instigate a civil war if Trump loses this election. So then what do you need to do? Then you need to be prepared to protect yourself by becoming armed and informed. And by the way, I've been promising you a video on the Second Amendment. I am a huge defender of the Second Amendment. I think every law-abiding African-American citizen should be armed because of the obvious threat that we constantly face since we have been in this country. If African Americans had been armed during slavery, that would have ended a lot sooner. But the laws, despite the Second Amendment, prohibited us from being gun owners. Well, I strongly believe that we African Americans, law-abiding citizens, should be armed, but informed about gun laws, about politics, etc. Because in my practice, I have seen a lot of African Americans get really jammed up, no pun intended, by being uninformed gun owners. Because the law is just not applied to us fairly and equally. I can tell you story after story after story of us representing African Americans who own guns or who use guns in law-abiding ways and still were charged with crimes. So, yes, we have a Second Amendment right to be armed, but we also need to be informed. So let me tell you, and informed. I want you to go over there. I want you to join that YouTube channel. It's really small, but I created the channel because of the very name of the channel, Armed and Informed. And by the way, we are fighting for our name. Someone is trying to take our name from us. I will share more about that later. We're in a legal fight for our name, Armed and Informed. It's our name. It's original. We have it trademarked, but someone now is trying to take it or cancel it. I'll share more information with you in the future, but go over there and please join Armed and Informed. And you'll see that it is a channel that is dedicated to the Second Amendment and to educating, especially African Americans, about gun laws. All right. So, unfortunately, we are looking at the potential of another civil war. Professor Walters says in her book that she doesn't think that we are really that close to it because certain things can happen to prevent it, especially, as I said earlier, if we keep Trump out of office and vote Joe Biden in, because whatever your issues with Biden may be, he's not a threat to democracy. Whatever your issues with him may be, us toward anarchy. Now, there are many on the far right who strongly disagree, but we have our common sense. We know which one of these candidates have shown us his disdain for democracy and how he wants to move us toward an autocratic system. That is the best way that we can prevent a civil war, by keeping that guy, Donald Trump, out of office. All right, I am Attorney Augustus Corbett, one half of the Defiant Lawyers. Again, we bring you this type of content every single week, as often as possible. If this type of content is your thing, if you like this, if this is what you believe needs to be said and done right now in our country, please like, share, comment, subscribe, and click the bell. Thank you for all of your support. Peace.
Hey, yo, what do y'all think of that? That was a good one. He's very informative, very, very informative. Anybody want to come up and say something? But I just thought I saw that and I said, damn, let's put that up there. Because sorry for that noise. Yeah, because Donald Trump is a fool. He already told, yeah, it sounded accurate, because Donald Trump is a damn fool. He already talking about doing stupid shit, and it ain't even summer yet. Ain't nowhere near November, and he talking about doing stupid stuff. He talking about he's gonna have poll watchers counting the ballots. I'm like, Lord, here we go. It ain't even, first let the folks vote before you start talking stupid, But that's against the law. Poll watchers they don't touch anything like the votes, and they don't count them. All they do is just watch and make sure ain't nobody doing nothing stupid. So this thing is going to be crazy. This year is going to be crazy because Donald Trump is not going to win. Everybody don't want him to win. The Supreme Court, everybody need to go get them people off the Supreme Court too, because they just keeping Donald Trump in power. He gets immunity to steal. Well, damn, I need immunity because I need some money. I need to go to the bank and steal from the bank so I could get immunity. That don't even make sense. People talking, doing stupid shit. It's Clarence Thomas and his wife, his funny looking wife, she done set up there, tried to help overthrow the government. And I don't understand why they don't see that it ain't gonna work for them either. I guess when you got that kind of money in the bank, I don't know. I ain't never had that much money in the bank, but I guess when you got that kind of money in the bank, you can do stupid shit. But anyway, so I didn't know if y'all would like that or not. But I found it interesting, and if you want to hear more from him, this guy here, him and his daughter, he has a daughter, and they very you know, they're very up on things. And he's a civil rights lawyer, and it does sound just about right. This stuff's been going on because Phil Donahue, when he had his show on in the '90s, he talked about law enforcement and teachers. Yeah, he always does come with good sources, Donnie. Anything he does, he comes with excellent sources. I've been watching him for a while, but you should. It's the Defiant Lawyers. You can check him out anytime. He got a lot of stuff. I said maybe once a week I'll put something up that he puts up. He's got a lot of things. But anyway, like I was saying before, Phil Donahue did a report on the thing about law enforcement in the '90s, and he said it in the '90s that the educators in law enforcement were part of the Klan and part of white supremacy groups. So it's been known. The Southern Poverty Law Center spoke on that for years, since the 1990s. They've been trying, and they found the fool. They never could find a fool. They never could find a fool until they found Donald Trump. They knew he was a fool, but it's backfiring on them because he single-handedly is tearing down the Republican Party, because the Republican Party is done. The traditional grand old party, that's what GOP means, grand old party. So he's done. He done destroyed the party. And that's why I say he ain't the brightest bulb in the lamp. And if they wanted to do what they want to do, like Project 2025, it, if they wanted to do all of that, they could have picked somebody better, because Donald Trump is not the one, because he ain't too bright, because he's robbing he's robbing the Republican Party. He using the money that should go to the party for other candidates. He using it to pay his legal bills. So you know where that's leading. I think that man is $1 billion in debt. If he was a billionaire, he won't be none by the time he get through going paying them lawyers. And I hope he paying these people, but he is paying them. From what I've been reading, he is paying them, but he paying them with the Republican Party's money. He ain't using none of his, because he ain't got that much money anyway. And I can't wait for her to take his shit. Lord forgive me, but I can't wait for him to take it. So anyway, I'm glad y'all found that interesting. I try to bring stuff out that people find interesting, because I find a lot of this stuff interesting, and I hope other people find it interesting too. So I'm going to end this unless somebody want to come up and say something. You want to come up and say something? Yeah, good sources. He got some good stuff on. I might put another one up maybe tomorrow, or maybe even tonight. I might put another one up before it gets too late in the evening. I've been kind of slowing down on doing stuff. But anyway, I'm going to end this live stream now. Hope you'll enjoyed it. Have a good evening, everybody.